As he returned home after months of wandering, the night was giving way to dawn, and a faint, gray light shimmered on the horizon. The air was cold, slightly damp, and outside the world seemed untouched trees, the neighbors' houses, and the narrow path leading up to his door. But as he took his first step inside, an unexplainable tension seeped into him, settling like a quiet, haunting thrill. It was as if he'd stepped onto the edge of another reality, where every element of his home looked the same but held something subtle and elusive, hiding just beneath the surface. He hung up his coat on the familiar hook by the door, feeling a strange pulse echoing through his veins, almost like a second heartbeat that wasn't his. The home, which usually greeted him with warmth and a familiar emptiness, now brimmed with an energy that felt foreign and yet intimately familiar. It was as if something, or someone, had settled here in his absence, leaving traces only his senses could detect but not quite see. He moved down the hallway, feeling the old floorboards creak beneath his feet, and with every step, the air seemed to grow denser, wrapping around him like an invisible veil. The scents were what struck him next. Faint lavender and something sweet, almost like a lingering warmth brushing over his skin. He knew this smell was achingly familiar, a distant memory surfacing from a place he couldn't name, filling him with a soft ache that was both comforting and disorienting. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself that perhaps he was simply exhausted, his senses playing tricks on him after the long journey. But as he continued, more unsettling changes caught his attention. In the living room, a few of his books lay scattered on the coffee table, open to pages he couldn't remember leaving them on. The blanket on the couch had been gently folded in a way he would never have done himself, with careful, almost tender hands. His favorite mug sat on the kitchen counter, still carrying the warmth of a recent touch, though he couldn't remember using it that morning. The silence around him wasn't the calm quiet he was used to instead. It felt charged, humming with an anticipation that had his heart racing, as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting. The absence of his dog, his loyal companion who would have bounded to greet him, struck him the most. Usually he'd be right there, tail wagging, eyes bright with excitement. But now, nothing. His chest tightened, a pang of worry nudging him forward. He began calling out, his voice echoing through the quiet rooms, only to be met with silence. The whole house seemed to be holding back, keeping its secrets close. He turned down the hallway toward his bedroom, his footsteps slow and deliberate, every sense attuned to the smallest of sounds, every shift in the air. The dim light of dawn now filtered through the windows, casting elongated shadows along the walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe with life of their own. He felt as if he was being watched, like some presence was silently studying him, familiar and yet completely unknown. The memory of a dream flickered in his mind, a recurring dream he had experienced in recent weeks. In it, he would see the soft outline of a woman's face, hear the whisper of her voice calling his name, and feel a warmth radiating from her that pulled him closer, wrapping around his soul. It was only now, standing in his own home, feeling that same pull, that he realized she wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Her presence lingered here, woven into the walls, the air, his very breath. This realization sent a shiver down his spine, an intoxicating thrill mingled with fear. He touched the edge of the table, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingers, trying to ground himself. His heart thudded with a mixture of dread and excitement, his mind torn between curiosity and caution. The house was no longer just a place, it was alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. In that moment, he could have sworn he heard the softest of whispers, almost as if someone was calling out to him, beckoning him deeper into the house. The soft, dim light bathed everything in a gentle glow, and he found himself taking another step, then another, unable to stop. His skin tingled with anticipation, his senses heightened to a degree he hadn't thought possible. It was as though the very essence of his home was shifting, aligning with something or someone that had crossed boundaries to reach him. His pulse quickened as he made his way back to the living room, searching, almost instinctively, for the origin of this intoxicating feeling. He barely noticed his own breathing, shallow and rapid, as he finally reached the center of the room. The air was thick, sweet, filled with an unnameable longing that resonated deep within him. There was an overwhelming sense of inevitability, a feeling that whatever was waiting for him here had been destined long before he could have understood it. He was no longer just in his house, he was in a shared space, a threshold between his world and another, both familiar and foreign, comforting and intense. Just as he began to question his sanity, he heard the sound of soft footsteps from somewhere beyond the door. His heart skipped a beat. It was her, the woman from his dreams, the presence he had felt all around him. He knew it as surely as he knew himself. Every instinct, every cell in his body surged forward, yearning to meet this unknown, this impossible presence. He could feel her, as real as the ground beneath his feet, as tangible as his own breath. In that moment, he knew that this home, his sanctuary, was no longer just his alone. It had transformed into something shared, something sacred, a space that connected them across worlds, across the very boundaries of existence. And with each passing second, the tension within him grew, a mixture of fear and an indescribable, aching desire to step forward, to bridge the divide, and meet her face to face. As he wandered deeper into his own home, an unsettling realization began to take hold. Every corner, every piece of furniture, seemed to carry faint traces of another presence. It was subtle, yet undeniable, like a whisper brushing the back of his mind. The familiar warmth of his house felt layered now with something foreign, a delicate, almost imperceptible veil draped over his reality. Each detail he noticed felt like a breadcrumb, leading him closer to something or someone that had been here, leaving behind a faint echo of their touch. He found himself lingering by the coffee table, where his books lay scattered, open to pages he hadn't marked. As he ran his fingers over the open pages, he felt a strange, inexplicable warmth spread from his fingertips to his chest. The passages were oddly poignant, laced with themes of longing, of love unbound by time or space. He recognized the lines but couldn't recall ever having stopped on those specific words. It felt like a message or a memory from a life he hadn't lived. His gaze shifted to the armchair by the window, where the morning light filtered through and bathed the fabric in a soft glow. The chair was turned slightly to face the room, a small, almost negligible change. But he never moved it from its place, and something about its angle, the way it seemed to open toward the space, felt as if someone had been sitting there, watching, waiting. He pictured her there, a woman he had never seen yet somehow felt in his bones, reclining softly as she traced her fingers along the armrest, leaving her silent imprint in the room. On the couch, his favorite blanket was neatly folded, arranged with a kind of tenderness he couldn't quite fathom. He picked it up, pressing the soft fabric to his face, breathing in. It carried the faintest hint of a scent he didn't recognize but felt inexplicably drawn to, a delicate fragrance, floral and earthy, tinged with a warmth that sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the blanket held onto the presence of someone who had cherished it, infused it with a warmth that made his skin tingle. In the kitchen, his eyes fell upon his coffee mug, left just off center on the counter. The handle pointed slightly to the right, a habit he knew was not his own. He reached out, wrapping his fingers around it, feeling an unexplainable residual heat. Had someone touched it moments before he arrived? The idea was absurd, yet the impression was vivid, almost tactile, and a thrill ran through him as he imagined her delicate fingers brushing the porcelain, leaving traces of her warmth for him to find. He opened his fridge out of habit, his mind clouded with a strange mix of disbelief and curiosity, only to notice a small jar of honey that he didn't remember buying. He picked it up, rolling it between his hands, feeling the thick, golden liquid shift inside. The honey was strange to him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd used it. But he could almost picture someone else standing here, spooning honey into a cup of tea, their presence so vivid it was as if he could reach out and touch them. Each of these tiny, nearly invisible details built upon each other, piecing together a picture of an existence that had lived alongside his own. His heart beat faster, pulse racing, as he felt the strange sensation of déjà vu wash over him, as though he had walked into a memory rather than his own home. It was more than just evidence of another person. It was a feeling, a warmth and intimacy left behind, woven into the fabric of his life. And every thread he touched brought him closer to her, an otherworldly visitor who felt as familiar as a heartbeat. He began to move more slowly, his steps measured and careful, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he anticipated the next sign, the next thread in this invisible tapestry she had woven in his absence. Passing his bedroom, he noticed a faint indentation on the bed, just on the left side where he never slept. The covers were slightly rumpled, as though someone had sat there, waiting. He reached out, pressing his hand onto the spot, feeling the cool fabric beneath his palm. A surge of longing rushed through him, as if he had missed her for lifetimes, and yet she was somehow here, lingering in the fabric of his world. It wasn't just the objects she had left behind, it was the way they made him feel. Every part of him tingled with a strange awareness, his senses heightened, attuned to the delicate shifts in energy around him. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something enormous, something that both terrified and thrilled him. The air was heavy, charged, and he felt as though he could reach out and pull her into his arms, feeling the invisible bond that had bridged their worlds. Then, as he approached the bookshelf in his study, he noticed something peculiar, a small pendant, delicate and beautiful, lying in the center of a book he hadn't touched in years. He picked it up, feeling its smooth, cool surface against his fingers, and a shiver ran down his spine. The pendant was not his, it was an artifact of someone else's existence, a fragment of her that had somehow crossed the boundaries of worlds to rest in his hands. The weight of it was oddly comforting, as if it held the essence of someone who had loved him deeply, someone who had been waiting to be found. Standing there, clutching the pendant, he felt a rush of emotion so intense it stole his breath. He could see her in his mind's eye, her image as vivid as the colors in a sunrise. Dark, shining eyes, a quiet smile, hands that seemed to know the shape of his face, the texture of his hair. He didn't know how he knew these things, but he felt them as surely as he felt his own heartbeat. She was real, she had been here, and every fiber of his being yearned to hold her, to bridge the gap between them, and finally meet the woman whose presence filled his life with warmth and a love that transcended worlds. Every step he took, every corner he turned, he felt himself coming closer, his heart beating with a mix of excitement and an aching sense of familiarity. The air felt electric, humming with an energy he could almost see, crackling around him like a current that pulled him closer and closer to the moment he would see her, hold her, and confirm that she was real, that she belonged here with him. And then he heard a soft sound from the next room, a murmur so faint it could have been a sigh or a whisper. It wasn't just his imagination, he could feel her, the weight of her presence pressing down around him like a gentle, loving embrace. In that instant, he knew he wasn't alone. She was here, somewhere close, waiting for him to find her. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned toward the sound, every nerve alive with anticipation, his mind flooded with images and sensations that were both foreign and yet so deeply familiar. He didn't question it, didn't doubt the reality of her presence. All he knew was that he had been waiting for her, just as she had been waiting for him, their souls intertwined across the fabric of existence, bound together by a love that defied explanation. With a final trembling breath, he stepped forward, ready to meet her, to cross the boundary that separated their worlds and claim the love that had drawn them together in this extraordinary, impossible way. His heart swelled with the realization that she was real, that they had found each other in this shared space, bound by an unseen force that was as unbreakable as it was tender, as timeless as it was true. He followed the sound, a soft, barely there murmur, like the quietest sigh, floating from the living room. His heart thundered, each beat louder than the last, filling his chest with a mix of wonder and trepidation. The air was electric, thick with a sense of mystery that wrapped around him, luring him forward. As he stepped into the room, his breath caught in his throat. There, sitting on the floor beside his dog, was a woman. But she was no ordinary woman. Her presence radiated an ethereal glow, as though she were only half formed from the same reality he inhabited. She turned to him slowly, her gaze meeting his with a warmth that sent a tremor through his body. Her eyes were dark and fathomless, holding a depth he couldn't look away from. They shimmered with a strange light, as if she carried entire galaxies within them, each one pulsing with life and memory. His dog lay comfortably against her, nestled by her side, as though he had known her for an eternity. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was a vision of someone he had dreamed of countless times, someone whose image had haunted him in fleeting memories and dreams he could never fully grasp. Now, seeing her here, in the delicate morning light spilling across the floor, felt like an impossible miracle. She spoke his name in a voice so soft, so familiar, that it tugged at his heart with a force he couldn't resist. Her voice was laced with memories, feelings, and a longing that resonated deep within him, as though her words were stirring something ancient inside him. Every syllable seemed to bridge the gap between them, dissolving the boundaries of time and space that separated their worlds. She didn't belong to this reality. He could see it in the way her form seemed to flicker at the edges, a faint shimmer that hinted at her ethereal origins. And yet she felt more real to him than anyone he had ever known. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice laced with a quiet vulnerability that made his chest ache. Her fingers gently stroked his dog's fur, each movement careful and tender, as if she was savoring every touch, every sensation. She looked at him with a depth of emotion that he couldn't begin to name, a connection that felt both immediate and eternal. He stumbled forward, feeling as though he were moving in a dream, yet every step felt solid, real, heavy with meaning. He knelt beside her, unable to resist the pull that bound them together, as inevitable as gravity. His eyes roamed over her face, drinking in every detail, every delicate line and curve, the soft sweep of her hair, the gentle smile that seemed to carry both joy and sorrow in equal measure. She was so familiar and yet so extraordinary, like the reflection of a memory he had long forgotten. He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed his fingers along the curve of her cheek, half expecting his hand to pass through her like mist. But her skin was warm, impossibly warm, and the soft sigh that escaped her lips at his touch sent a shiver through him, sparking a wave of emotions so raw and intense that he felt overwhelmed. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes briefly, as if savoring the sensation, and he felt a surge of longing so deep it stole his breath. As they knelt together on the floor, she began to speak in a voice that trembled with emotion, telling him of a world beyond his own, a place where time and distance were meaningless, where souls connected beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. She told him that in her world they had known each other, loved each other, with a bond so profound that it had echoed across the fabric of existence, pulling her here, into his world, to find him once again. Each word she spoke wove a tapestry of their lives, lives he hadn't lived but could feel so deeply within him, as though each memory she shared was his own. With each revelation his heart swelled, filling with a sense of purpose, of belonging he had never known before. She described how she had glimpsed his life through fragile moments, a passing shadow, a dream, the scent of a familiar flower. In these small fragments she had seen him, reaching out across the divide, yearning for him in ways that defied explanation. And he understood, with a clarity that transcended reason, that she was not merely a visitor, she was part of him, woven into the very fabric of his existence, as if they had been destined to meet, no matter the boundaries between them. Tears glistened in her eyes as she told him of her journey, of the sacrifices she had made to be here, to reach him. Every word felt like a confession, a prayer, a promise. And he listened, spellbound, his heart breaking and mending with each revelation, feeling her presence anchor itself into his life. He realized that this love they shared was something greater, something that defied the very nature of the world around them. As she spoke, his dog nestled closer, a quiet witness to the reunion of two souls who had been lost to each other for far too long. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, resting its head in her lap, as if bridging the gap between them, grounding them in the shared warmth of this singular moment. His fingers brushed against hers, and he felt a surge of warmth, an indescribable electricity that coursed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the love that bound them together across the divide. He found himself lost in her gaze, feeling as if he had known her for an eternity. Every fiber of his being ached with the knowledge that she was real, that she had crossed the bounds of reality to find him, that she had chosen him above all else. Her love was a force, a quiet, powerful presence that wrapped around him, filling every hollow part of him with a warmth that chased away every doubt, every fear. She was here, and that was all that mattered. In that moment, he felt himself surrender, letting go of every question, every hesitation. He leaned forward, drawn to her like a moth to flame, his heart pounding as he closed the space between them. Her breath mingled with his, a soft, warm promise that lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken words, with love that transcended everything they had known. His lips brushed against hers, and the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the embrace of a love that was both gentle and fierce, timeless and endless. As they kissed, he felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, a peace that resonated within his very soul, filling him with a certainty that defied explanation. She was here, and together they had rewritten the rules of reality, bending them with the force of a love that could not be contained, a love that reached beyond the limits of time, space, and logic. This was his home, his heart, and she was the missing piece he had been searching for his entire life. When they finally pulled away, her eyes met his, filled with a quiet, knowing light. She smiled, a soft, radiant smile that spoke of hope, of faith, of love that would endure beyond any world. Her hand intertwined with his, her fingers fitting perfectly against his, as if they had always belonged there. In that moment, he knew that they would face whatever lay ahead together, as one, bound by a love that was unbreakable, eternal, and true. They sat there, holding each other in the quiet aftermath of their revelation, their hearts beating as one, their souls entwined in a bond that would outlast even the stars. They sat close, barely inches apart, wrapped in the intimacy of a moment that felt as vast as the universe itself. The room around them seemed to fade, as though their presence alone illuminated the space, blurring the edges between worlds. Her hand was still warm in his, her fingers softly entwined with his own, grounding him in a reality that was both foreign and profoundly familiar. As they settled into this strange, shared silence, he sensed the beginning of something delicate yet boundless, a love story that stretched across the very fabric of time and space. Their eyes met, and he felt an unspoken understanding pass between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the miracle that had brought her here, to him, defying every law of reality he had ever known. It was as if, in that gaze, she was peeling back the layers of his soul, revealing parts of himself he hadn't known existed. Her presence was a reflection of his own longing, of dreams he'd harbored but never fully understood, of a love so powerful it had shattered the boundaries of existence just to reunite them. Tell me how you found me," he whispered, his voice laced with wonder and disbelief, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile spell binding them together. She hesitated, her eyes softening, as if gathering the courage to speak a truth too immense to capture in words. I saw you first. In glimpses she began, her voice a gentle murmur that sent shivers down his spine. In my world, I would catch fragments of your life, moments that felt like dreams. I could see flashes of your face, hear your laughter, feel your presence like a distant melody that I couldn't quite hold on to. Her words spilled out like a confession, filled with the weight of her journey, the sacrifices she'd made to find him. He felt his chest tighten, his heart racing at the thought of her searching for him, reaching across dimensions with a determination he could barely comprehend. Did you feel me too? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though he were afraid of the answer, afraid that this might all be a beautiful, fragile illusion. Her lips curled into a soft smile, her gaze never leaving his. More than you'll ever know, she replied, her words a quiet, unbreakable promise. It was as if our souls were calling out to each other. Every time I felt lost or alone, I could feel you, like a steady heartbeat guiding me, reminding me that you were waiting for me, somewhere beyond the reach of my world. Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating in places he hadn't known were empty until now. He found himself leaning in closer, their breaths mingling in the scant space between them. Every nerve in his body felt alive, his skin tingling with the overwhelming intimacy of being so near to her, of feeling her presence as something undeniable, something that filled every hollow corner of his heart. And now that you're here, he murmured, his fingers tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand, does it feel real? Or are we still just dreams to each other? She closed her eyes, taking in a slow breath, as though savoring the texture of his touch, the warmth of his skin against hers. It feels like everything, she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of universes. In my world, I had only glimpses, fragments that were never enough. But here with you, I feel whole, like I've found the missing pieces of myself. Their hands remained joined, and he could feel her pulse beneath his fingertips, a steady rhythm that matched his own, as if their bodies were in perfect sync. He couldn't stop himself from leaning in further, his forehead resting gently against hers, feeling her breath ghost over his lips. Her presence was intoxicating, a warmth that seemed to seep into his very bones, dissolving the walls he had built around his heart. Every time I closed my eyes, he began, his voice soft and vulnerable, I would see you. I'd feel you, like a shadow slipping through my dreams. There were nights I could hear your voice, faint and distant, calling my name. It haunted me, that feeling of you so close yet always just out of reach. She nodded, her fingers tightening around his hand as if reassuring him that she was truly here, that she was as real as the ground beneath them. I know that feeling, she murmured, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. There were moments I thought I'd never find you, that I was chasing a phantom, a memory that would never come to life. But I couldn't stop. Something inside me, something in my soul knew that you were waiting, that we were meant to be together, no matter the cost. The silence that followed was thick, charged with a passion that needed no words, a love that had crossed beyond the limits of their worlds. He found himself tracing the line of her jaw with his fingertips, mesmerized by the softness of her skin, the way her breath hitched at his touch. Her eyes fluttered closed, and he leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead, a tender, lingering kiss that felt like a promise. As he pulled back, she opened her eyes, looking at him with an intensity that sent a thrill through his entire being. I've loved you for lifetimes, she whispered, her voice a sacred confession. In every reality, in every universe, I would find you. You are my home, my reason, the echo in every heartbeat. Her words resonated with a truth so profound it made him ache. It was as though she had spoken the words that had been buried in his soul, words he had never dared to acknowledge but had always known. He felt himself drawn to her like a gravitational pull, his hand finding the small of her back, drawing her closer, their bodies fitting together as if crafted for each other. In that moment, he knew that nothing else mattered. The worlds they came from, the boundaries they had crossed, it all faded away in the warmth of her embrace. He held her tightly, his lips brushing against her cheek, then her temple, then finally finding her lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, filled with the unspoken love they had carried across dimensions. Their kiss lingered, a quiet surrender to the feelings that had brought them together. It was a kiss filled with longing, with the quiet desperation of lovers who had been parted by the stars themselves, only to defy the heavens to reunite. He felt her arms wrap around him, pulling him closer, as though they could dissolve into each other, losing themselves in the embrace of a love that defied explanation. When they finally pulled away, her eyes were filled with a quiet joy, a peace that mirrored his own. She smiled, and it was like seeing sunlight for the first time, warm and blinding, filling every dark corner of his heart. They sat there in silence, holding each other, knowing that their love was a force as timeless as the universe itself, a bond that would endure beyond the reach of any world, any reality. In the stillness that followed, they sat close, wrapped in each other's presence, and he could feel something shifting within him and awakening, like the opening of a door to a part of his soul he hadn't known was closed. The air between them vibrated with a silent energy, as if their connection was more than just physical, woven from threads older than the stars, binding them in ways that went far beyond the constraints of this single moment. Her gaze met his, and he felt himself drawn into the depths of her eyes, dark and endless, as if they held the weight of every life they had ever shared. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that what he felt for her was not simply love, but something far more ancient, something that had been waiting patiently across time, lying dormant until now. In her gaze, he saw the faintest shadows of shared memories, fragments of lives they hadn't lived in this world but which resonated through their souls like distant echoes. She reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek, a gentle, lingering touch that held 1,000 unspoken promises. Every brush of her skin against his sent a rush of warmth flooding through him, filling him with an indescribable sense of belonging. It was as though his body recognized her touch as a missing piece, a key that unlocked feelings that had been waiting, hidden and unspoken, for her return. "Do you feel it too?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the delicate magic holding them together. "It's like I've known you forever. Like you've always been here somehow, in every heartbeat, every dream." She nodded, her expression softening with a mixture of awe and understanding. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's as if every lifetime, every version of myself has loved you. Even before I knew your name, before I knew this place. I could feel you, calling to me, drawing me across every distance." Her voice grew softer, more vulnerable, and she looked at him with a devotion so fierce, so raw, that he felt it sear into his heart. A shiver traced down his spine, and he tightened his hold on her, feeling the need to keep her close, as though she might slip away if he let go. There was something terrifying and beautiful in realizing that they were bound by forces beyond his comprehension, by a love that stretched across the vastness of existence, enduring through every possible reality. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, the certainty that, in any world, they would find each other, drawn together by a connection as deep as the roots of the earth. He could feel her breath against his skin, soft and warm, and with every heartbeat, he felt his soul reaching out to hers, merging in ways he could not explain. They weren't just two people sitting in a room, they were pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together, fragments of a whole that had been split across time, now reunited. Every look, every touch was laden with memories he couldn't place, emotions that felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like the melody of a song he had known since childhood. He traced his fingers down her arm, feeling her shiver under his touch, and something in the way she leaned into him, in the way her body responded, told him she felt it too, that undeniable pull, that sense of completion. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing naturally, and he marveled at how perfectly they fit, as if their hands had been made for each other. Holding her felt like the most natural thing in the world, as though he had been doing it for lifetimes. "There's so much I want to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But words feel so small compared to what's between us." He looked into her eyes, feeling a surge of emotion so strong it left him breathless. "I don't need to know the details, the lives we've shared, or the distances we've crossed. All I know is that I found you, and that's enough. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." Her smile was soft, almost wistful, as she pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes. "I've waited so long to hear you say that," she whispered, her words so gentle they were barely audible. "In every world, in every life, I've searched for you, hoping that when I found you it would feel just like this. And it does. It feels perfect. It feels like home." The word hung between them, resonating deeply within him. Home. He hadn't realized until now just how much he had longed for that feeling, how incomplete he had been, searching for something he couldn't name. But in her presence he felt whole, as if every empty part of him had finally been filled. She was his home, his anchor, his heartbeat. Their foreheads pressed together, breaths mingling, he felt the space between them dissolve, leaving nothing but the shared rhythm of their hearts, beating in time. He felt as if he were dissolving into her, becoming part of her. And yet, for the first time in his life, he had never felt more like himself. She was not just his lover, not just a woman from another world, she was his other half, the missing piece he had been searching for across time itself. They sat there, in a silence that was rich and full, as though no words were needed to express the depth of their connection. They were beyond words, beyond gestures. They existed in a space between worlds, a space that was theirs alone. It was a connection that could not be severed, a bond that transcended time, space, and the fragile constraints of human life. In her embrace, he knew that they would face whatever came next together as one, bound by a love that had existed long before they had ever met, and would endure long after. As he held her, he felt the truth settle deep within him. They were eternal, their love stretching like a thread through the fabric of reality, unbreakable, unending. This was a love that had always existed, and would always exist, carrying them through every life, every world, every dream. They sat together, the silence between them heavy with an unspoken promise, one that transcended any vow made with words. The feeling that filled the room was more than love. It was a sense of belonging so deep it made him ache. She was not simply a visitor from another world. She was his partner, his anchor, his home. And as he held her close, he realized that this connection was not just theirs. It extended to the life around them, to the little moments they would share, to the family they would become. His dog, who had settled comfortably by her side, looked up at her with a quiet, knowing loyalty, as if he too recognized her as something more than a stranger. She reached down, stroking the dog's fur with gentle fingers, and he felt a pang of tenderness watching them together. The way she moved, so naturally, so affectionately, as if this was already her place, already her family, made his heart swell. His dog, his loyal companion through so many years, had accepted her as easily as he had, sensing her role in their lives without question, as though she had always been there. He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him as he imagined a future where every moment of his life would be colored by her presence, by this family that had grown from an impossible, otherworldly reunion. They didn't need to say it aloud. He could feel it as plainly as he could feel his own heartbeat. She was here to stay. They were not just lovers separated by worlds, or two souls reunited. They were becoming a family, a bond that nothing could break. She lifted her eyes to him, catching his gaze with a soft, vulnerable look. "I was so afraid, coming here," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Afraid that you might not recognize me, that I might be nothing more than a shadow to you, a memory that couldn't take form." Her words were laced with both fear and relief, as if she were shedding years of doubts, releasing them into the quiet of their shared space. He tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles over her knuckles. "You're more real to me than anything I've ever known," he said, his voice low and steady. "I may not understand how you came here, or why the universe allowed us to find each other like this, but none of that matters. All that matters is that you're here now, and that this is where you belong." As he spoke, he felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, a deep instinctual desire to guard her, to keep this newfound family safe. It was more than love, it was devotion, a fierce loyalty that made his chest tighten. She was part of him now, as inseparable as his own breath, and he would do anything to hold on to this fragile, beautiful reality they had created together. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, and he could feel her relaxing, letting go of whatever doubts or fears she still held. Her presence melted into his, and he felt their lives intertwine, like vines growing together, supporting each other, rooted deeply in a shared soil of love and trust. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, and they sat in a silence that spoke more than any words could. Their family, simple, unexpected, perfect, was already here, in the bond they shared, in the loyal presence of his dog curled up beside them. They stayed like that for a long while, allowing the silence to settle, letting themselves sink into the new reality they had created together. Each passing second felt like a small eternity, a gentle, grounding reminder that they didn't need to rush or look forward or look back. They had everything they needed right here in this moment. And yet, there was something else too, an unspoken dream of the life that lay ahead of them, of the days and nights they would share, of laughter echoing through the rooms of this home, of quiet evenings spent together by the fire, of morning sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating her face beside his on the pillow. He could see it all so clearly, like a beautiful story unfolding in his mind, one they would write together, one page at a time. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her gaze warm and filled with a quiet strength that took his breath away. "I'm here," she whispered, as if reaffirming a promise, her eyes searching his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "I'm here, and I'm yours. This is where I belong. With you. With us." He felt the weight of her words, a powerful commitment that resonated through every part of him. It was a promise not just to him, but to the life they were building, to the family they were becoming. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a gentle, lingering kiss, pouring every unspoken emotion into that touch. A kiss that was a vow, a declaration of the life they would share. When they pulled away, she smiled, a soft, radiant expression that lit up her face, filling him with a joy so profound it almost hurt. She glanced down at the dog, who looked up at her with a quiet trust, his tail thumping against the floor in a silent affirmation of their shared bond. It was as if the dog, too, had accepted her into their family, understanding instinctively that she was not a passing presence, but a permanent part of their lives. And he knew in that moment that whatever challenges they might face, whatever uncertainties lay ahead, they would face them together. They were a family now bound, not just by love, but by something even deeper, an unwavering commitment that defied reason and transcended reality. Together, they would make this house a home, filling it with memories and laughter, with moments of quiet tenderness and fierce, unwavering love. In the days and weeks that followed, the house began to feel different. Every corner, every quiet room held traces of her presence, small reminders of the life they were building together. She brought a lightness to the space, a warmth that made it feel more alive, more real than it ever had before. She became a part of him, a part of his home, and together, they crafted a life that felt both extraordinary and beautifully, profoundly ordinary. They were, at last, a family complete in a way he had never imagined possible. And as they stood together watching the sun set beyond the horizon, he felt a deep, abiding peace, a certainty that this was exactly where he was meant to be. With her, with their dog, with the life they had built, and the love that had brought them together against all odds. They were whole, timeless, bound by a love that would carry them through every world, every lifetime, forever.